We were a polygamist, Mormon-based community. I come from a family of 24 and had 3 moms. And as a woman inside of this religion, I was going to be a mother and have as many children as I could. And I knew that I was going to belong to a man who would have many wives. We were kept secluded from the outside world. We didn't go to public school. We didn't watch movies. We didn't have magazines. We didn't watch television. Everything about our lives were very much centered around our belief system. We would wake up first thing in the morning and everyone in the family home would gather for prayer, and we would read all different kinds of scriptures from the Book of Mormon. And then we would get up, go to school, and immediately the first thing that we would have in school was more religious teachings. We would have our morning class, which was all centered around studying the Book of Mormon, as well as preaching from the principal, who was Warren Jeffs. In our school, for the girls and boys, we were kept separate. The classes were in different parts of the building, because that was a part of our religious teachings, was the girls and boys do not fraternize in any way until they are sealed in marriage. In school, our training as women started as early as 4th grade, where we would have what was called home economic. And as we progressed in school with each grade, it was Warren Jeffs himself that was teaching the women this class on how to be women. Now, for the boys, it was different. They were getting a lot of teachings on what it meant to be what they called a priesthood man, and what it would mean to have this power that was ordained into the men from the priesthood hierarchy. All of our lives really revolved around this concept that we were God's chosen people and that we were here to continue his work, and that everyone else was either an apostate or a Gentile. And a Gentile was the rest of the world, the people that had not been born into it or who had not converted into it. And the apostates were people that had had the opportunity to be given this gospel and this doctrine, and they had chosen out. They were considered the evil of the most evil. So much of my childhood, we were always told about the end of the world was coming, because that's what the prophet was saying, is the days are short. The Lord is going to send destruction down upon the earth, and then he's going to save his faithful people. And then after everything else that is evil is destroyed, then they will be able to go and create this utopia that was called Zion. And so anything that you wore, or maybe your hair wasn't done correctly according to Warren, then that's what people would get in trouble for, as well as any kind of fraternizing. I remember getting in trouble at a very young age in 1st grade because I had friends that were boys. Then one other time I happened to wear a necklace that I was given from my father. And I wore it to school, so incredibly proud of this necklace and so happy to show it off to my other girlfriends there in my class. And I got a call to come into the principal's office, and he asked me to take it off and put it in the garbage. And then just went on an incredibly long lecture about how those are worldly possessions, that I was worshiping evil by choosing to wear them. So the control that the church had really became very evident in my life pretty early on. My dad was deemed an unworthy man, and he had his power stripped away from him. My younger brothers and sisters and 2 of my dad's wives were taken away from him and moved 400 miles away to another community from the same church. My mother was given to another man as a wife, and then he became my father. And I was immediately just brought into this large family, and he had over 20 wives. He had 60 plus children in his home. And to have my life so radically shifted at such a young age of 13 was incredibly difficult. But more than anything, I just didn't understand really what was happening. And for the next year and a half, I would really struggle in trying to adapt into this home and trying to learn how to refer to this new husband of my mom's as father. They believe it so intensely that they would tell me that my very DNA was going to change from that of my father's to match that of this new man who was my father. And I believed it because that's all the information that we had. In the culture of the FLDS, women are basically property because all marriages are arranged through the prophet. I would be told to be married at 14 years old. Innately inside of me, there was a fire that even the religion couldn't take. I refer to it as true spirit. And I did something that very few women inside of our community had ever done. I questioned And that act of questioning turned into a week long of an intense experience of talking to every form of leadership that I could possibly talk to inside of the church. All I wanted 2 more years. I wanted to be 16 instead of 14. I finally found out who I was to be married to, and they were going to arrange me to be married to my first cousin. And it was someone that I had known my whole life and vehemently did not like. There was something about the energy between us that was just so difficult for me. I would feel the hair stand up on the back of my neck when he would come into my vicinity. And the idea of being married to him forever, to have his children, to that was my future. I couldn't do it. I realized there was nothing I could do to stop the marriage. Even my mother couldn't stop it. My dad had been removed from my life for a year and a half at this point, so I had no idea if he knew what was going on. But on the day that I was to be married, I remember waking up, and I had spent the whole night before with my mother and my sister, and they had handmade me this gorgeous wedding dress. And I remember putting it on and doing my hair and looking in the mirror and feeling, this is what death looks like. And we were driven several hundred miles away from our home into Nevada, because Nevada had a lot less strict rules around children, young girls being married. And so they would marry us in Nevada so that they wouldn't have to be accountable for underage marriages. But I found myself standing in a hotel room in front of the leader, the prophet, who in my mind was God on earth. And I'm standing next to this man who is my cousin that I'm going to be married to. And I just, as the vows started being read, I started to sob. My whole body was just shaking because I was sobbing. I couldn't get myself to say I do. The words were caught in my throat. I had my mother stand up next to me and hold my hand, and she just squoze my hand. And I knew in that moment that everything in her life and my life and all of my family was riding on this moment. This wasn't just about my future. This was the future of my family. And so I just finally said, okay. I kissed him in a quick peck and I ran out the door. When I was married, I was so incredibly innocent. Because of the way that women are raised inside of the FLDS, there's not a sexual education. The first time that I ever was exposed to was so confusing. And I remember just shaking as a leaf and just begging it to stop, because I didn't believe that what was happening was right. I'm being educated through rape, then having religious leaders in my life who are furthering that education, and just instead of hearing me and protecting me, they were sending me back with words such as, you go home and you obey and you submit yourself to your husband, mind, body, and soul. Behind closed doors, it was so hard. There was extreme and domestic. I would be forcibly required to fulfill my marital duties, as they would be said to me. And I would just lay there and stare at the ceiling and just count as high in my numbers as I possibly could so that I could check out of what was happening. And after the event would be done, then I would be shamed and reprimanded intensely for being tempted, but also just feeling so unworthy. Every time that I would have a miscarriage or I had a stillbirth child, then I was the problem, because I was not worthy enough or obedient enough of a woman to even carry a child. I know now that I have a very unique condition, and I have negative blood that created a situation to where unless I have a very specific kind of medical attention, I can't successfully carry children. In the time it was happening, to go through those experiences once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times over those years. And, I'm 16 and 17 years old. I was feeling less than human. And through the process, there were so many times where I would just ask myself, what if you just ended it? But the way that I was cultured and raised is the ultimate sin. I realized nobody was going to protect me. And so the only way to protect myself was I would take my vehicle and I would sleep away from my husband. There was no hell on earth or in heaven that was as bad as the hell that I was feeling and experiencing. And there came this pivotal point in it where the last time I ever spoke to Warren, he reprimanded me for being an adulterous woman because I had had a friendship with a man who was also in the community. He had finally given me what I had been asking for since the day I was married. And that was, he gave me a release, which is the equivalency of a divorce. But he told me that you will never go to heaven unless you repent. And the only form of repentance for you is blood atonement. And it's this teaching they have that you give your own life in a sacred ceremony to exchange for your sins. He then turned to the man who I'd been married to and he said, "A job well done." And there was something about that just cracked everything in me. And I looked at him and I said, "There is no God that I know of, that I believe in, that could look at you and say a job well done." And that night, I packed up my belongings and I left in the middle of the night. And I did leave with the same man that I had a friendship with. People that leave the FLDS as domestic refugees. We have all of the same things that a refugee needs. We need housing and clothes and learn how to work and get jobs and get bank accounts. And that process of adapting into the outside world would take many years. But in the first year, it was such a difficult process for me. This time where you're completely revamping your belief system. After I had left and was adapting into the world, I fell in love with the man I'd left with and we had a son. And the first time that I ever held my son, I had this major eye-opening epiphany. And what I didn't realize is that my body had kept all of that inside of it. There's the science now that shows that the body keeps score of what has happened. And so a lot of my life, I was having panic attacks and I was struggling from depression. I started to realize that what had happened to me would likely happen to my younger sisters. They were so close to me and so important to me. But right around the birth of my son, they disappeared. And that experience of completely losing contact with them and realizing that what had happened to me would likely happen to them, it's what fueled me to come forward and tell my story to law enforcement. The experience of telling my story is what ultimately led to charges being filed against the cult leader, which was Warren Jeffs. And there was a very long, intense, internationally covered trial that happened. In the moment, I thought I was doing this for my sisters, but what really happened for me in that moment of standing on the witness stand, getting to face Warren Jeffs, to hold his gaze, because I had been trained to drop my gaze. If I was in the presence of the prophet or the leader, I was to drop my gaze and I was to be submissive and I was to make myself small. But to hold that gaze and to hold it as long as it took until Warren dropped his gaze, that was me standing for me. Because that one act was that moment when I said, "You no longer control me." After Warren Jeffs was convicted in Utah as accomplice, then I had a lot of backlash. And I was really surprised at how even the larger scape of the world they were kind of confused about this, but they really didn't believe that this was happening. This is modern day America. How is this happening? The people of the FLDS are an example of that. I look at them and I see that their belief in one man, their belief in Warren Jeffs, and their belief in this doctrine is so strong that all of the evidence can be laid out in front of them and they disregard all of it. Because even during Warren's trial, he had a moment of sanity, I say, and he confessed that he was a fraud in front of his brother, in front of several people. And the recording of it was distributed in a lot of different places. And even with that, they still believe that that was a test to test their faithfulness. And so for the years that would follow Warren's trial, because he was convicted in 2008, and then it's been a continual process of finding ways to reach people inside, the slow breaking down of the culture of the FLDS. And so many thousands of people have since left and started to adapt their life on the outside. Part of that process was I realized that we had to educate the world. And that led me to writing a book. I wrote a memoir. And so it became very important to work with different kinds of organizations or start organizations or work with law enforcement or government agencies to try and create a network that could truly support people as they made that transition out. Because for some people that make that transition out, it's so difficult that they can't successfully make it. And so they end up returning back into it because they can't figure out how to live on the outside world. I made the choice to move back to the community that I had ran away from freedom at 18. In 2016, the act of moving back into it to me was that way of saying, if we're going to truly change this, we have to start from the core of where it all started. And since 2016, it's been this incredible journey of everything from revamping the cities and taking the religious control out of the cities to we voted in our very first female mayor into the town. And then it's been a process of teaching people and helping people get home ownership and layers and layers and layers of trying to rebuild a community. One of the things that I'm so excited is I'm launching my own podcast, and it's really focused on the stories of the people from the FLDS, because in the last few years, it's become quite an interesting topic to people all over the world. And there's a lot of information that's out there about Warren Jeffs and the leadership and the story around it. I recently did a Netflix documentary called Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey that illustrated that in detail. One of the biggest pieces I tell people is if it feels wrong, there's a reason it feels wrong. And please, please, please do not ignore those communications from the body. But the first step is to question, and then they make the next step, and that is to take a step for yourself. And if that step leads to another step, that's a path. And that is the path of heart and spirit. I, Elissa, was stronger and more capable and resilient and kinder and fiercer than anything that could ever happen to me.